through step one. So that's step one of the planning process, was identify your focus crash type, facility type, and risk factors. Step two is now getting a little bit more away from the crash data and those locations with crashes, and we're focused on our entire system and trying to figure out which system or which sites across our system have these risk factors that we're focused on. So we're going to start out with some network. We're going to conduct a risk assessment across that network, and eventually we'll end up with a prioritized list of potential sites. So again, we have 3 tasks that we need to go through, and I'll explain each of those in a little bit of detail. So task 1, what do we want to start with? Well, if our focus crash type was roadway departures and our focus facility type was curves on rural 2-lane roads, those curves might be a good place to start. So I would start with a list of all of my curves, and then we need to go through and add some detail to that. If it was intersections, same deal. We start with the list of intersections, and then we can add columns to that list and identify specific characteristics. So that's what's shown in this sample table here. It's just a list of potential curves to start at. We have the length, and maybe these are segments, and we have the traffic volume. So some very basic information, but we need to expand this table to include some additional risk factors. So things we might want to add, you mentioned earlier, traffic volume we already had, but we could look at the curve radius. We could look at the risk related to the roadside. So this is called edge risk here, but really something related to the clear zone. Some other things that they looked at, they did include the road departure crash history, or the density of road departure crashes as a risk factor, and access density. I may not necessarily correlate access density with roadway departure crashes, generally more related to driveway crashes, but maybe a number of driveways or intersections are leading to a number of rear ends, and maybe some vehicles are running off the road to avoid a rear end crash. Not sure, but that was included as a risk factor. And really what we're trying to do here is for each site, mark off whether or not that in fact has the risk factor present. So then you can total up all of those columns and say, well, this site has a 5 risk score, or a 4 risk score, or a 3-star risk score. So you could use a simple star rating. You could just add those up as all ones and say I have a risk of 5, risk of 4, or a risk of 3. You could weight these factors differently, especially going back to those charts. If we saw that certain risk factors seem to be much more of an issue, but thinking back to the comparison of the clear zone versus the access density versus the narrow lanes, those bars were in different proportion to each other. So some risk factors may show up as a very prevalent risk factor. Others may be maybe a risk factor, maybe not. So you might want to weight these and give maybe traffic volume a score of 2 points if the risk factor is present. Maybe access density gets a half a point if it showed up to be maybe a risk factor, but maybe not. And then you could total up those scores. But this is where you're actually assigning a risk score to the individual locations. This can be done in a number of different ways. There's no right or wrong answer, but use the data you have and do what you can with the resources available. So if you can't go through and collect the curve radius for every curve, maybe you have somebody go through and just mark down the number of curves per mile. So for any segment, you could say we have such and such curve density. Or if you are looking at individual curves, maybe you could do a quick assessment of whether it's a sharp curve or a gentle curve. So we've seen some of these already, but this is really where we want to get into this risk factor assessment and figure out which ranges are actually presenting some elevated risk. So in this case, the blue line again represents the proportion of our network with that factor present. So 10% of our locations have a traffic volume between 800 and 1,200 vehicles per day, but the severe lane departure crashes represent close to 15% of the crashes on those sites. So they're overrepresented. So what we would say here is maybe the traffic volumes between 800 and 2,400 vehicles per day represent the greatest risk, and we would assign those sites some risk score. So if the ADT fell out of that range, it doesn't get a risk score. So any site with a traffic volume between 800 and 2,400 gets some type of risk score. This is another way to look at it. We have our 5 risk factors here that were shown on a couple slides ago. Traffic volume, the density of roadway departure crashes, and again, they drew some threshold and they said above this threshold, we're going to consider that a risk factor. If your site has more than so many roadway departure crashes per mile, we'll give you a risk score there, or check that off as a risk factor. And below that, we'll say it's probably not as much of a risk factor. Access density, it's really not showing much of a difference between sites with the risk factor and sites without the risk factor. So again, there I would say access density may not be showing up as a risk. Curve radius certainly is, and the edge risk assessment certainly is. The orange line here is representing, again, the proportion of your system that has the risk factor present. And what we're looking for here are risk factors that are maybe present on, I don't know, 10 to 20 to 30% of your system, maybe 40%. But if a risk factor is present on 80% of your system or 90%, it's not really a risk factor. It may not be the best risk factor to use to narrow down your list of sites. So I mentioned the weighting. You could assign all of your risk factors an equal weight, or you could weight them differently depending on how much of a risk you think it actually is. There's different ways to do that. This is just one example. So you could have some thresholds where if your risk factor is overrepresented by a certain percentage, so if 25% of your system has some edge risk rating, an edge risk rating of 3, but 50% of your crashes are occurring on sites with an edge risk rating of 3, that's overrepresented by 20 percentage points. So maybe that gets a higher score or higher weight than the others. So depending on how much of a difference there is between the percentage points, you could use that as a guide. The other thing you could do is use the percentage of the system with those crashes. So maybe this factor is present in 50% of severe crashes. So narrow shoulders are present in 50% of runoff road crashes, and I'll give that a higher weight than I would if maybe some other risk factor, access density, appears to be a risk factor, but it's only present in 15% of the severe crashes. That gets a lower score. So again, this is just an example. You can use it as a guide or as you will, but the real key point here is you can assign different weights to the different factors. This is what we kind of want to get to and what we want to see. We're really figuring out here, did we select the appropriate risk factors or not? So there's a lot going on in this chart. I'll try to break it down a little bit. But each bar here represents the percentage of sites at each risk level. So 15% of our system didn't get a risk score. It had none of the risk factors present that we were interested in. 27% had 1 risk factor, 28% 2 risk factors, and so on. So a very small percentage of our system, only 3%, had all 5 risk factors present. And that's good. It's helping to narrow down our list of sites. But what we really want to see here is this validation that risk is actually increasing with the number of risk factors. So these two curves represent the severe crash density and the severe lane departure crash density, which was our focus crash type. And we're seeing that for sites with low risk ratings, they had a very low density of lane departure crashes. But as the number of risk factors went up, and lane departure crash density was one of those risk factors, but it was only one of those risk factors. So as you add more risk factors in, the density of these lane departure crashes increased as well. So that's really validating our assessment and telling us that we probably selected a pretty good group of risk factors here. So once we've done that and we've verified that we've selected the right risk factors, we can then move forward to the next decision, which is how many of these sites do we treat? Do we only treat the 5-star locations? Do we have enough money to go to the 4-star locations or the 3-star? So that's the next decision point, is how far do we want to extend down the list? So I guess before we move on, any questions related to the prioritization of sites or assigning risk? All All right.
How common is that star factor used? I haven't seen that before, other than US RAP or something like that.
That's it. So that's a good example. US RAP, which is the Road Assessment Program. There's an international version, IRAP, and a US version, US RAP. But that uses a star rating. I'm not certain how common that is. So yeah, I would say I haven't seen that too many other places. But you could just as easily switch these out with a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. But good question. Any folks familiar? Dan, just a second.
Had a different question for you. What's the measure for density that you're using? I may have missed where that comes from, the severe crash. Is that like a per mile or
Yep.
measure? Okay.
Yes, good question. So how do we calculate density? These are crashes per mile or access points per mile. And I think there was a curve density as well. The curve radius was included. But going back to our list of sites, these corridors may be of different lengths. So certainly as you have a 10-mile corridor, you would expect to have more risk factors present, and maybe some of the shorter corridors have very few risk factors. So one way to normalize that and put everything on an equal playing field is to go with the density, so that something per mile. Good question. Any other thoughts or comments?
Frank, Minnesota also used the star rating in your experience. They looked at the risk factors and they gave each star. I think Thurston County also has done that. Some of them may give a half star to.
Okay,
It's the same as 1 through 5. It's not.
thanks, Jerry. Yeah, so Minnesota used the star rating, and Thurston County may have as well. So we've assessed the risk factors. We've figured out which ones are really presenting an elevated risk and which are not. We're prioritizing our locations for potential improvement. So at this point, we haven't selected countermeasures. We've gone through, and just like with the hotspot approach, we need to diagnose the issue before we come up with a countermeasure. Otherwise, we're putting the cart before the horse, and if we're going out and installing rumble strips or putting in speed humps because somebody requested it, that's not the appropriate way to address a situation. It's what crashes are we trying to address, what factors are leading to those crashes, and then what countermeasures could mitigate those factors. So at this point, we have to figure out, do we have enough data to evaluate these risk factors and come up with appropriate countermeasures? If not, we might need to collect some supplemental information.